Great, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andy Miah, and I'm a professor at Salford University. And thank you for sticking with this till the end of the day. This is the final keynote slot, and it's an absolute pleasure to have a chance to speak, not least because I think for many people, DCF was my last event before the pandemic, and it's my first event since the pandemic. So it's really exciting to be here back in the same place, seeing all the wonderful companies and people that are here, and talking about a subject that I'm really passionate about and have been working on for, wow, nearly a decade now. And I was saying to somebody earlier that we started talking about esports in a serious way just after the London 2012 Olympic Games. And at that point, everyone in the sports sector, which, as you will know, is a heavily digital sector, in fact, I think has become increasingly digital first over the last few years, were very much not keen on esports, didn't see quite how it fits with what the sports values and brands are all about. And the whole world has changed, not just over the last 2 years through the pandemic, where many organizations have had to pivot into some kind of esports proposition, but also the ecosystem around the sports world has become predominantly focused on esports in the broadest sense. So what I want to do today is to walk you through some of the things that I think have been really exciting over that period, give you a bit of a sense of what esports means and where it is right now, but also talk, and particularly talk, about where I think it is going. So just a quick show of hands in the room, how many people feel sort of comfortable, knowledgeable about esports, just to sort of know where we are. I've got a few hands, probably about 50% of the people. So for those that are new to this world of esports, and I have these conversations all the time, most people that I speak to don't really know what esports is. But we're essentially talking about competitive computer game playing. So it's the computer games that you will know or see other people play, like FIFA, but it's also games that are outside of the sports genre, like League of Legends or Dota 2, or even the games that you play on your mobile phones. And one of the things that's really exciting and still relatively embryonic in the UK is the rise of mobile esports gaming. You will have seen over the last couple of years, a lot of platforms are now making sure that their title can be playable across platforms, so across consoles, PCs, and mobile devices, and that's certainly a direction of travel for the industry. But I remember it was probably about 3 years ago when I was taking the train from Manchester back to Liverpool, and it was a very typical crowded commuter train. And there was this guy, must have been about 20 years old, just sort of standing up, looking at his phone, and I glanced over, and he was watching a streamer streaming his gaming content. And it was that moment where I thought, gosh, this is really transforming how we sort of think about what people consume in terms of media content. My son, who's 11 years old now, has grown up a gamer like many others, very fascinated by all the games he can play on his console or the mobile phone. And actually for him, the mobile games are the ones that he gravitates towards. So this world of esports, coming out of the gaming sector, finding common values with the sports competitive world, has really sort of crystallized over this 5-year period. But what's really been exciting is that journey into these technologies, into the different ways in which we see this arena evolving. And that's partly why I want to propose this concept of esports 2.0 in this talk today. In part because I think we're very well established as a community now. Esports has been going for quite a few years. You will have seen there have been international tournaments over that period. You may have seen also on the BBC, it was last January, I think, where we saw the first sort of BBC broadcasting of an esports event. So we see mainstream media get involved with this, cover it, talk about it, promote it, and also professionalize it. And that's been a big part of what's happened over this period too. So there's increasing range of professional values that underpin this practice and industry of esports, which is going on. But we also see it as an industry that is very much pioneering technology. So I think for me, what keeps me in this world is partly just the degree to which it is trying to innovate creatively, technologically, and you see that amongst the partners that are operating within this space. So if you think about those big organizations that are in the world of sport, that have, in many respects, pioneered some of the sort of most latest tech innovations in media broadcasting, not just the television companies, but organizations like Intel that are Olympic partners, they're also very much part of this space. So at the moment, we find ourselves in a very rich place where esports have a pretty solid base, a base that is international in nature, but also a lot of innovation within the gaming technology itself, which is beginning to show a new era of what this might look like. So I want to talk about some of these trajectories, think about some of the new communities of participation that surround this activity. This guy on the train that I took from Manchester to Liverpool, watching a streamer on his mobile phone on his commute back home like it was the most normal thing to do, is amongst many young people, I think especially, that don't really watch television much anymore. They watch a lot of streaming content. My son, if he gets gaming time, which is rare, I worked out last September. Last September, the Chinese government instituted a new policy for school-age children, whereby they are only allowed to game online for 1 hour a day, only over the weekends, and between 8 and 9 p.m., which, if any of you have children, is quite restrictive compared to what children typically expect from their gaming activity. And upon learning this, I realized I basically have that policy in my household already, where Ethan gets quite limited gaming time, but his consumption of screen time isn't then just the playing of the game, it's the watching of the players as well. And I think in many respects, creatively, the reason we're at that point is because with games, anything can happen. The storyline isn't defined, and there's a sense of excitement of it being this real live experience that's taking place. And the live economy is part of the value system of the esports industries. Back when this all started going, people said, well, why do you need to have kind of physical arenas where you come and play esports? And it's partly that connection with the real-time live moment that has explained why we've now seen the explosion, really, of this industry. And we see many companies getting involved in that space. And they get involved in lots of different ways. So we've seen companies that are creating augmented reality applications. This goes back all the way to 2015, where you have the transformation of exercise into a playable, gamified experience. And many of these concepts have been realized only over the last 5 years, and the markets around them are still very much beginning. So for me, this connection between what we see in the esports industry is intimately tied to this transformation of technology. And I think actually what's really interesting is that the people that are designing the technology, the people that are working on these experiences, have that at the heart of their value system. So it's the playfulness, it's the joyfulness of playing games, it's the possibility of integrating new experiences into things that we already do, like snowing or skiboarding, that are at the heart of this ecosystem. And of course, it's already a very significant space. There's lots of examples of companies that have been experimenting with it, lots of new companies that have created the environments, the platforms, the communities where we see this esports activity take place. This is a screenshot from 2016, which was the beginnings of the British Esports Association, which I'm very delighted to work with, and has been working very much on that grassroots community around esports to build a pipeline of participation that is informed by skill development, informed by bringing people together to make things happen, whether it's producing events or whether it's creating new types of games. This is part of that innovation culture. We've also seen a growing number of activities that have really been able to pioneer some of these experiences and create new ways of thinking about our world, trying to modify our expectations of what live events should be. So companies that are reimagining physical space to amplify it, to extend that reality into something new. When Facebook pivoted into Meta last year, we saw them also create a range of virtual worlds, which, has anyone's popped into a Facebook virtual world recently? A lot of fun, huh? It's a slightly crazy world they are, I find. Very difficult to navigate, but people are trying to find their feet in it. And I think literally it's like trying to walk for the first time. So people are just beginning to develop the sorts of conventions and behaviors around what's required within these virtual environments. And it's that sort of creativity, that uncertainty that I think is really also part of that excitement. We also see a lot of new designers work in this space too, creating alternative experiences. So this augmented reality table tennis table can be seen as a part of this ecosystem of the new kinds of activities that are coming down the pipeline. Activities that allow people to play together physically, play together remotely, and to create new kinds of sports. I think one of the really exciting aspects of this is not just trying to replicate the sports that already exist within our worlds that we see on television or not in most cases, but actually creating new forms of participation. One of the things that I do as part of my work is go to the Olympic Games every 2 years. But the really interesting event for me has been the Youth Olympic Games, which was launched in 2010. And this is the games where they have really a mashup of different types of activities. They're really experimenting with new forms of competition. So the basketball isn't a standard 5-on-5 basketball, it's a 3-on-3 basketball. There's a slam dunk competition. There's a whole range of ways in which these sports are being reimagined for, I guess, the next generation. And that's really, I think, a big part of this picture too. The esports industry that is emerging, that is developing, that is being created, is really responding to the behavioral expectations of the next generation. The generation who is increasingly expecting to interact with more than one thing at the same time. We've known for many years that people will watch television and consume content on their mobile devices, and those behavioral shifts are having an impact on many different industries, of course, too. So the arenas that we create, the types of activities we create, need to respond to that. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting is that if you look at what the Olympic Committee's done over the last few years by creating its Olympic channel, which essentially is a kind of Facebook for sports, a television, an online television aggregator, essentially, it's trying to make sure that it creates content that you interact with whilst watching the sports themselves. So rather than you watch the Olympic Games on your television set whilst interacting on WhatsApp on your mobile phone, they want you to have this connected experience so that you are giving all of your attention to the Olympic brand. And I think part of that journey for them has been to realize that actually the activities that people do in these spaces are going to be far wider than just those sports that are part of the games. I think we've also seen a cultural shift as well that explains some of this. So you'll remember back in 2016 when Pokemon Go became a popular game, and it still is for many kids. I know lots of kids that still play it a great deal, and I think that aspect of layering onto physical reality, digital artifacts that people care about, value, and which promote physical activity is where we get closer to this idea of a phygital future, a physical digital future. Now, there are many games that have been quite as successful as Pokemon Go, but the principles, I think, are very much in place. And certainly one of the concerns that we have at the University of Salford, but also I think more widely in this research world, is how we encourage healthy screen-based behaviors. So children these days are very much immersed in their screens, not just for their own leisure activity, but actually in the classrooms as well. So a big part of our work is to try to think about and assist those educational pathways into this kind of activity that encourages positive behaviors, encourages actually partly teachers to think about the implications of the demands that are placed upon children to be present in digital space. So we're very focused on and anxious about servicing this aspect of our digital worlds. How do we make sure that when we encourage children into digital lives effectively and think more about their worlds as being digitally mediated, how do we ensure that those experiences are positive? How do we make sure that we guard against some of the risks that are associated with that, either a loss of reality in perception or physical terms, or a sense of which their physical matters less than the digital? And I think these are some of the things that we're seeing come out of some of the discussions in work programs around artificial intelligence, how we can bring greater sense of social responsibility into this space. It's also trying to give people a sense of how creative these things can be. So I've noticed over the years, if you work closely with the sports sector, you learn, oh, can we get the sound off this, please? We learn that people actually believe that that sport is open to everybody, but it really isn't. People get turned off from sport at a very early age. If we're lucky, they find their way into physical exercise. And platforms like this, which is the game Zombies Run, which allows you to use your mobile phone, where you open up the app, you find yourself as a character in a zombie apocalypse running away from zombies, is a great example of that. So no longer is exercise this horrible, boring thing in a gymnasia. It's now a horrible, exciting thing running around the physical world as a character in a story. So the writers behind this, I think, successfully migrate that exercise experience into something that is more enjoyable, and particularly enjoyable for those populations that currently or historically have sat outside that world of sport, that got turned off from the culture of sport very early on in their life. So we need more of these things. We need these fusions of creativity, and where we bring the artists, the designers, the innovators, the scientists, the technologists together to reimagine those physical digital interactions that we create. And we see that emerging in lots of different contexts. The part that really excites me about esports isn't the pro scene, which is incredibly exciting. These are big, highly staged, produced events that are really exciting to watch and to see in person. But it's the amateur experience that I think is particularly exciting, both from the perspective of sort of social responsibility, but also by giving people a sense of expanding the possibilities of their lives. So this example from the trip, the Les Mills, is, I think, a stepping stone to where we are now, but it gives you that idea of being able to physically play in an imaginary world and see your exercise rendered into a different space, something alternative to the everyday. It brings together music, cinema, and sport into this really creative, exciting environment. So it's very much about imagination. It's about trying to inspire people to think differently about the things we do and create new types of experiences along the way. And again, we've seen different companies do this in lots of different ways, but the foundation to it is all those creators that are building the places in which this can take place. So Populous, the really world-leading architecture firm, created this visualization of the esports village a few years ago, which gives you a sense of where we're heading in terms of the technology and in terms of the physical experience. So the esports village is a playable space where you're not just watching the players take part, you're interacting with the spaces too. You're having your own gaming sports experiences, and we're seeing all over the world now the creation of esports arenas where Populous, famous for many big sports arenas, are now turning their design hands to this. And I think it's partly because what's also interesting about esports is that the design problem is very different from conventional events. It maybe gets closer to staging music concerts than perhaps sports events, because you have this field of play in which anything can happen, and where we see now the possibility of reimagining the arena for a new generation of people, where we have this integration of physical and digital experiences. So all of these things are part of the steps towards where we sort of find ourselves now, where we see esports flourishing, because you have all these different innovation companies operating around that space, trying to create new forms of technology, new forms of experience, new modes of interaction, and of course, new forms of spectator experience. So Sony, a couple of years ago, filed a patent for a virtual reality spectator experience where, for an esports environment, of course, most esports presently are still very much flat screen experiences, but the beauty of CGI is that we can re-render it in 3 dimensions, and then as a spectator, you can be a participant within those spaces. And the possibilities around that are really endless. You don't need to watch the flat screen anymore. You can immerse yourself in the field of play as it's happening in a way that really isn't possible for televisual or film-based content. And this gives rise to a whole new era of experiences that people may have. And these experiences are now being fused together through events that we see pop up around the world. This example from 2017, where we see an augmented reality dragon, a performer in the opening ceremony of the League of Legends finals in China, where when you're in the stadium, you see through your mobile device this layer of unreality that is then part of the staging of the event, where the digital artifacts become performers in this physical place. And the beauty of that is that it bridges that gap that we know is a problem between our physical world and the digital lives that we lead. These things are often separate. And there may be good reasons to keep them separate sometimes, but you can see the creative innovation that goes into this. And where historically the Olympic Games particularly has been the place people look to see the cutting edge of staging experiences, we now see in esports a whole new era that's taking place. this is also why I'm excited about them. I think it's something that is really dramatically innovative, creative, and is bringing together so many of these professionals to realize something that hasn't been done before. And the technology behind it is also exciting. So we've heard stories from people working in esports programs where an esports lab has been created or a facility has been created in a place where there's limited infrastructure and where this high-tech gaming space is also a resource for the community as a high-technology computing space for a whole range of other functions. And because there's a kind of mobilization around esports from national governments, from big sponsors who want to be part of this and grow the community of participants, and the games publishers themselves that want to grow their audiences, we see those sorts of investments made that otherwise really wouldn't be. So one organization that I work with very closely is the Global Esports Federation. And what we've been trying to do over the last couple of years is to build that international community. So worked very closely with the United Nations to bring esports into many countries around the world. But what's been really exciting about that has also been working with a range of their innovation partners, so the members that work with the United Nations around telecommunications, seeing how we can use esports as a catalyst for change in a range of geographical regions and a range of technology environments as well. So one of the exciting things that's underpinning esports is the games themselves, and the technology that goes into the games is, again, incredibly exciting. So you will remember, or some of you will remember, back in 1997, the biggest test between human and machine was the chess match between Garry Kasparov and IBM's Deep Blue computer. And of course, the computer won in the end. The latest iteration of that has been the world's greatest StarCraft 2 player, which is an esports title, and what was then the latest computer, which was Google's AlphaStar computer. And again, as sad as it might be, the computer won again. But the tests, and the important point, is that the biggest test that was seen to be the highest level of challenge to test out intelligence was a computer game. So we see the technology that underpins these activities as being really pushing the boundaries of technology more generally, which again is why you see companies like Samsung or Intel working closely with esports to see how far we can push the boundaries. This is a bobsled simulator. Actually, I think it's a skeleton simulator that was exhibited at the Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games a few years ago. So you can see how these are all often embryonic examples of how the technology is being used, but can pave the way for perhaps alternative activities that we may enjoy and participate in. We've also seen a closer relationship between the physical events and the digital events that take place alongside them. So Virtually Live, which was very closely connected to working with the Formula E industry, was realizing what it described as ghost racing. So you could be playing a game on your console and then also racing alongside the players as it's taking place. So you have this, again, fusion of the amateur spectator experience and, in fact, pushing the act of being a spectator from a sedentary, perhaps seated experience to an active participatory experience. And the participatory economy around esports is certainly one of the big drivers. In this case, what you're seeing is a real-time or near real-time experience of a physical race being rendered into a virtual reality environment. So we don't just watch these things on flat screens as they're happening, we can also watch them from within the VR headsets. And these are also giving rise to new kinds of economies, new kinds of expectations as well. Expectations that are part of the history of digital sports productions or media sports productions over the years. Everything from slow motion replay to underwater filming, it's all been pioneered at these sorts of events. At the Olympic Games in Beijing just this month and last month, we've seen the use of 16K broadcasting. We see a whole range of companies that are trying out the latest stuff and seeing if it can give us a sense of what's coming along down the road. We've also seen a growing number of communities that are creating these physical arenas in which people can compete and participate. So this is a game that came out of Japan called Hado Sport, which involves players wearing a virtual reality headset and situating themselves in a physical arena in which they play out a competition. And this concept video is pretty close to the reality of the sport itself. There's a UK centre in Birmingham that produces Shadow Sport events, and this is beginning to emerge as a new form of competition that's having its own venues created for people to participate in. So incredibly exciting, and again, incredibly exciting from the perspective of wanting to bring more physical activity into our digital spaces and encourage people to think about the relationship between those two. Because I think we still are somewhat anxious about screen behavior. You may have seen that a couple of years ago, there was a National Centre for Gaming Disorders created in London, treating what is now classified as a disorder in the international list of classifications. So there's a concern about how this may develop, and certainly trying to bring these sorts of experiences into our digital lives is part of that journey too. We've also seen the broadcasters themselves experiment with new techniques of sharing what's happening in the world of elite sports, using these sorts of augmented reality overlays to more adequately or in a more compelling way communicate what's happening in the field of play. So all these things are very much joined up in this world, I think. And that's, again, what's partly exciting about it. I think part of the opportunity to get involved with these industries is the opportunity to connect with these different innovation companies that want to experiment with new forms of visualization, new forms of interaction, and new ways of thinking about how we engage people on content. And I think that esports have done incredibly well at perfecting the art of content engagement. We're also at a point where we're really seeing that circle almost completely squared now, where we see esports entering the physical space of those major sports events that happen around the world, the most exciting one of which is coming up this summer in Birmingham, where the Commonwealth Games, we're really delighted to be working with, through the Global Esports Federation, staging a world's first esports competition as part of the program. And as many of these international events start to think about this space, we're going to see a lot more of this kind of activity occur. I was telling somebody earlier that Usain Bolt did an interview last autumn where he said that a big part of his success as a sprinter can be attributed to his life as a gamer, which you kind of think, well, how is that exactly? How did gaming help Usain Bolt be a better sprinter? And the way he explains it really coheres with a lot of what people in the esports world think about as the value of esports. It's not just the competition of esports that's fun and exciting. It's the transition and transferability of skills that esports brings, whether it's through the pursuit and struggle that is the competition of gaming that you're enjoying and trying to pursue, or whether it's the dexterity and focus that you get by having to concentrate at very high levels in these competitive environments. I think the most remarkable aspect of the esports story is how many of these skills that are relevant to esports are being applied to lots of other settings. So at British Esports, we're really delighted to work with lots of other sectors to bring esports into their organizations, whether it's the military, the police. We have many communities that are entering this space and utilizing esports as a platform for community building, but also skill development. A friend of mine who's a pro esports player, but also a doctor, I asked him whether in fact he felt that being a doctor helped him be a better esports player. And he said the opposite was true, that in fact the skills he developed as an esports player have really helped him be a better doctor, which is fascinating to me. I mean, it's mind-blowing, but I think it explains why there's such excitement, certainly across the educational sector. So we now have quite a clear pipeline of courses for esports. There are now nearly 100 colleges that are running BTEC qualifications in esports, increasing numbers of universities that are offering degrees in esports as well. And every week it feels like we're seeing new positions and new programs in universities that are bringing esports together. So all of these things, I think, are incredibly exciting because they are allowing us to think differently about reality. As a philosopher that works in a university, thinking about the implications of new technologies, what compels me about them is the way in which they challenge our sense of what's real and what's not, confront us with new considerations about the kinds of lives we want to lead, and then how we build value around them. This example from Arcadia TV is showing you how much of this is becoming a transformative environment for physical space, where you are now interacting, running around arenas, interacting with digital objects as part of your competition. And this is really, I think, the next step of the technology, where we have not just those digital spaces where people are participating and interacting with each other through remote environments, but where the physical arena for the esports world is about to absolutely grow significantly. We saw this again given legitimacy just last year with the postponed Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games. A month before it occurred last year, we saw the creation of the Olympic Virtual Series, where some of these activities, some of the Olympic sports activities, were then created in virtual worlds through computer games environments. So it was only a handful of sports, but it was a first step. But this is the closest the Olympics has got to making esports part of its program. It was very much an experimental thing. The Olympics, and I would say sports generally, and particularly the sports media, are still trying to figure out how to interface with the esports world, how to connect it up with the physical sports that take place. But we've seen so many examples and demonstrations of that over the last couple of years, when many of those federations had to pivot into a completely different proposition because their events didn't take place. You might have seen, I think I remember back when the pandemic was really getting started, there were some football clubs that were putting up massive screens where people could then log into Zoom or something and be a kind of virtual spectator, which seem a little bit ridiculous now, but I think certainly those were the steps that opened the door towards more innovation and trying to see how we can have even more integration of that digital innovation in the physical sports themselves. We've seen also experimentation with the televisual content too, so we're not just watching the players on a screen and seeing what they do, we're also seeing the rendering of things like biometric data, so you can see how fast the heart is beating of the athlete as it's taking place. And these are all ways in which we're sort of tinkering with the architecture of the media sports ecosystem to see if there's new ways we can create and enrich the experiences. So I think this has a lot of implications for the digital industries, not least of which is collaboration across sectors. The excitement, as I mentioned, for me, is in bringing these people together from architecture, from design, from theatre staging as well as the competitive side of sports production, the organization of the events themselves, which are their own sort of beast of managing the production of these events. But by bringing all these different organizations together, by thinking about that kind of creative possibility that this space allows, I think it's really the heart of our digital industries at the moment. We've heard statistics that describe how the gaming industry is bigger than music and film put together. But the excitement, I think, is in hopefully getting us to a place where those anxieties we have about our digital lives can be a little bit more diminished by trying to reimagine how we interact with each other in digital space. And I think that's why esports is really exciting. And I think that's where I'll leave it. So thank you very much. Very happy to take questions. Okay, anyone got any questions? Yeah, thank you. Oh, we've got a mic, I think.
Given young people's consumption of esports and everything is obviously growing significantly, what do you think that has in terms of influence on esports kind of taking the audience that traditional sports has in the future?
It's a great question. I think that I think there's a real divide between the historical and let's face it. I mean, the Olympic Games happened, last month. Really, I mean, Paralympics is happening right now. I mean, my feeling was that when that was taking place, and it's weird for me because I usually go to the games and see it and experience it that way, whereas this one, I was at home watching it. And my sense of it, and the time zone may make a difference, but the BBC that was covering the games, it wasn't terribly high on the priorities in terms of how they positioned the activities. And I think that filters down very much to young people's impressions of it taking place at all, actually. I know lots of people that didn't watch any of the games, which is crazy to me, growing up with basically the Olympic Games. And so I think there's a real gap that we know exists. I think the average audience for the Olympic Games is 55 plus. And so there's a concern about how or not just the Olympic Games, but sports generally modify themselves for a younger generation that really aren't watching either television or even live sports content. So I think that's partly why the Olympic Committee has really tried to shift its perspective on esports over the years, because they realize that kids aren't watching. And it's not just that they're not watching now, it's that the habits that they're developing to not watch will last for far longer. And I think the Olympic Virtual Series was an attempt to try to see how they could bring those two things together. But it's a real challenge. I think one of the challenges for them is that many of the esports titles, they have very little to do with sports at all. They're very much located in the fantasy realm, I would say. And so, I think that sports should always be reinvented for the next generation. And this generation's sports are esports. A step towards that we have seen in the last couple of years, where the Olympic Games has integrated skateboarding, climbing into its program, breakdancing as well. So they're kind of aware that they need to change, but it's a big step to leave behind. They still have Greek wrestling in the Olympic Games, and not many people do that. So it's a big challenge. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think given people's just attention as young people, I think traditional sports have really struggled to go to the places where young people are.
Yeah.
Adapt to the channels and adapt to, and I think the fact that literally so many young people, they are spending most of their time, looking at influencers, and what do these influencers do? A lot of the time just gaming.
Yeah.
And that's where their attention is. The fact that young people, they don't want to be sports people anymore. They don't want to be Olympians. They just want to be YouTubers.
Yeah,
I
massively.
think has a huge influence.
And it was really interesting when the Olympic Committee had its annual session last summer. The Olympic Committee is composed of lots of 70-year-old plus people, but also an active athletes commission. And in a section that was on virtual sports and esports, all the athletes, the contemporary athletes, all said that gaming is a part of their lives. And I think it's a wake-up call for the industry to see, actually, we need to think about this a bit more carefully. But you know what? My son's favorite app at the moment is Grip Tonight, which is an app for bouldering. So we go bouldering quite a bit, and he likes getting his next level. And I think that's one of the things that many sports haven't quite figured out their way into, that gamified experience that platforms like Strava and Zwift have managed to do really well. Thank you. Any questions? One here. Thank you. Oh, but microphone. You can ask a question too, Slay. Anyone else?
I'll ask a question.
Go for it.
Do you ever envisage a day where maybe in schools they might, fully embrace something like esports maybe in lessons?
Oh, wow. I mean, that day is today.
Yeah.
So I think that we saw a statistic that around 60% of schools around the UK are looking to build an esports program. In fact, my son's school in the last term has created its first esports team, and they're competing here in Manchester at host this month, in fact, a week and a half from now, in the North of England semi-finals. So I think sports schools are absolutely doing that. And had a conversation with a woman from Children in Need earlier this week, and they found that over the pandemic especially, many kids have relied on gaming as a space of solidarity, of community, and participation. And I think those stories of sort of good news and good experiences is a big part of that world. It's funny because I think lots of people still also feel like they just wish their kids didn't do more gaming. And so it's a kind of strange disconnection between these two things. But it's remarkable to me to hear people outside of the esports sector just say how excited they are about it. Organizations that you wouldn't think would get anywhere near this a few years ago because they thought, well, gaming is the evil of society, which it has been for many years. So it's a big shift that's happening, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions before we wrap? Yeah, we'll get another one here. Great. Thank you. Oh, so yeah, question was AR or VR?
Yeah, which one do you think will be?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard to choose one, really. I'm actually really excited about VR gaming. I think that the example of Arcadia TV, where you have physical arenas, where you do have the AR experience, is probably the more exciting one. But I think for traditional gamers, the virtual world and the sort of complexity of storytelling that you can build into those experiences is pretty hard to beat as well. I think a lot of people have pivoted from VR to AR thinking that's the future, but I think both are pretty good. Cool, thank you. Right, looks like we're wrapped. No other questions before we... Well, I'll stick around here if anyone wants to have a chat afterwards, but I think we're done. Thank you very much. Cheers, everyone.